Hello, everybody. I thought today you might like to hear this story about a car called Gumdrop. Now, Gumdrop is this car here. It's an Austin Clifton Heavy 12.4 made in 1924, and it's owned by Mr. Oldcastle, and that's the man who's driving it. So, one day, Mr. Oldcastle got a letter from the local show, which is a bit like the Wangaratta show. And it said, "Mr. Oldcastle, if you'd like to bring along your car Gumdrop to our show, and on the way, if you could pick up some children in town, we'd very much appreciate it because we would really like to have you and Gumdrop here." So Gumdrop is the car, and here is Horace. And Horace is Mr. Oldcastle's dog. And the three of them always go together everywhere. So wherever Mr. Oldcastle goes with Horace and with Gumdrop. So Mr. Oldcastle said, "We're going to have to wash Gumdrop before we go this afternoon, so we better hurry." So Mr. Oldcastle, he got outside and he washed Gumdrop and he polished up all the brass and just made Gumdrop look so nice for the trip. But as he was finishing off, along came this man here, Goth Jones. Now, Goth Jones is a bit of a scrap metal dealer. And he says, "Hey, what do you want for that old crock? I might want to buy it off you." "That old crock is my car, and Gumdrop is not for sale." And he said, "And I'm very busy, so if you don't mind, I'll bid you farewell and I'll get on with my job." So Goth Jones was told to go. Well, when Mr. Oldcastle came out to get going, Goth Jones had gone, and he said to Horace, "Jump in, we've got to get going." So he switched on the engine and he swung the starting handle. But Gumdrop wouldn't start, and just then along came Mr. Puttyfat, and Mr. Puttyfat was on the way to the show as well. And Mr. Puttyfat, he's got a horse-drawn cart. So he says, "What's the problem, Mr. Oldcastle?" He said, "I can't get Gumdrop to go." He said, "But I could get it to go if you would give me a tow with your horses." Mr. Puttyfat said, "I'm happy to do that." So he took the horses off, hitched the horses to the front of Gumdrop, and towed Gumdrop until Gumdrop's engine started. Well, that was good. So Mr. Oldcastle thanked Mr. Puttyfoot, but he said, "You look very sad." And he said, "Well, yes, someone's stolen the brass lamps off my wagon." "Goodness," said Mr. Oldcastle, "that's no good." He said, "But look, I'm in a hurry. I've got to go and meet the children, so I'll get going." So he jumped into Gumdrop, and as he drove off, he reached for the horn to toot the horn, and the horn was gone, nowhere to be seen. There must be a thief around somewhere. It must have been that Goth Jones. He must have stolen it. And you know what? He must have stolen your lamps off your wagon as well. So he drove that way in the purple van. Well, Mr. Puttyfat, he jumped into Gumdrop and he said, "After him, by George. We've got to catch him." And off they drove to try and catch Goth Jones in the purple van, which was now some distance ahead. So they drove for a while and they went around a corner, and when they got around the corner there was this Rolls Royce in the road, a very old Rolls Royce, but you know, Rolls Royces were the finest cars in the world back then. And this one was owned by, you'll like his name, Colonel Sir Horatio Fotheringay Bassington, and he looked pretty miserable. Mr. Oldcastle said, "What's wrong? You don't look very happy." And he said, "The silver lady from my radiator is missing. Have you seen a thief around here?" "Well, yes," said Mr. Oldcastle, "and we're chasing him at the moment." Well, the Colonel jumped into the Rolls-Royce Silver Ghost. "After him, by Jove," he commanded, and both cars, the Rolls-Royce and Gumdrop, set off to try and catch that purple van. Now suddenly, as they were driving along, some way ahead they saw the purple van was stopped. And Goth Jones had jumped out of it because he knew he was being chased, and he ran into a field. But what did he find in the field? He found this bull. Now this bull's name is Balthazar, and he was pretty angry. So he started chasing Goth Jones. Horace the dog, he started chasing the bull. Mr. Oldcastle, he started chasing Horace. And then the others joined in the chase as well. Mr. Puddyfat and the Colonel, they all started running around this field. Well, Goth Jones was too quick for them. And he jumped back into his van and he drove off. Well, Balthazar, the bull, he was already running quite quickly, and he jumped through the fence and he landed in the back seat of Gumdrop. Goodness, have a big bull in the back seat. But Gumdrop wouldn't start. So he said to the others, "Give me a push start and we'll get this car going again." So they push started Mr. Oldcastle. There was no time to lift Balthazar out of Gumdrop, and anyway, he looked very comfortable in the back of Gumdrop. They got the car going, but where was Horace? Well, Mr. Puddyfat said, "I saw him chasing the thief in his van." So we thought, he's probably in Goth Jones's van. "After him, by gum," growled Mr. Oldcastle as he drove on again. And now Gumdrop was in double trouble now. Remember that Gumdrop had to stop in the town and pick up some children, and they're waiting by the side of the road. And Mr. Oldcastle and Gumdrop, they're in a hurry, they're chasing the thief. But anyway, they stopped and they said, "Just pile into the car, we're on a chase and we've got to catch the thief." Well, the children thought that was pretty good. They said, a chase, that'll be good fun. So they were all in the car chasing, all in Gumdrop, chasing the purple van. And that went on for some miles until they had caught up with the purple van again. And right where they caught up was the entrance to the show. Well, Goth Jones couldn't stop by now, so he drove right into the show. And Gumdrop and the Rolls-Royce Silver Ghost, they drove in straight behind him. And there they were. They were chasing the purple van round and around the ring at the showgrounds, just like at the Wangaratta showgrounds, there's a ring around it. And people thought it was a pretend chase and they all cheered. They thought it was pretty funny. But when they dashed out of the ring again, Gumdrop's engine stopped. The magneto had finally broken and Gumdrop just couldn't go anymore. Gumdrop was now in real trouble. "Catch that van," roared the Colonel. And they all jumped out and ran after the van. And there were such crowds there that the purple van had to stop too, and Goth Jones jumped out and they chased him. He ran one way and there was the Colonel. He ran the other way and there were the children. He ran back towards Gumdrop and there was Balthazar the bull. Well, Balthazar woke up, unstuck himself and jumped out of Gumdrop. He saw Goth Jones. He didn't like Goth Jones. And he roared. The thief was terrified. He turned back again and ran straight into the arms of a large policeman. And he was caught and the chase was over. Well, so they looked in the purple van And the Colonel found the silver lady that goes on the radiator of the Rolls Royce, so he was happy. And Mr. Puttyfat, he found the 2 lamps off his wagon, so he was happy. But Mr. Oldcastle, he was disappointed. No Horace and no horn off Gumdrop. But just then, he heard a bark, a familiar bark, and it was the bark of Horace, and it was coming from Gumdrop. And he went and had a look in Gumdrop, and there was Horace with Gumdrop's shiny brass horn. Because Horace had been in the van, and when the van stopped, he recognised the horn, took it in his mouth and brought it straight back to Gumdrop. Isn't that good? So the others came back too, and they congratulated Mr. Oldcastle on his good fortune that he had Horace and the horn back. However, Gumdrop was broken down and couldn't go. Well, the Colonel said, I've got a spare magneto in my Rolls Royce, and I'd be happy to give you that magneto to make Gumdrop go again. So, Mr. Oldcastle took the new magneto and he fitted it into the car. Horace helped by bringing a spanner. They got it all fixed up. Mr. Oldcastle swung the crank handle to start the engine. It started at once and it purred very sweetly, more sweetly than ever. That's a good outcome, isn't it? So then it was time for Mr. Oldcastle and Horace and Gumdrop to go home again. So they're driving out, and Mr. Oldcastle thanked everybody, and as they drove off, Horace gave a happy bark, and Mr. Oldcastle honked the horn. His troubles were over, and Gumdrop's troubles were over as well. And that is the end of the story. I hope you've enjoyed it. Bye.
Finished, Papa?
Yep.
Let's turn it off.